Okay, so today I'm going to do another recap session of my Twitter post for the Court of Reason, which these are basically just terms and logical razors that I use in my debate format from 2013. And so last time I reviewed up to here, the closed structure contrivance. So let's just look at them and we'll give like a little feedback and other background on what they exactly mean. I kind of like doing it this way and to have them chronicled in some way, but it's also a little bit difficult too. I don't really care whether anybody's really looking at them, but it's just good to have it saved. But I don't know if it lends itself to being stolen now. Not that I really care, but whether through error or ulterior motives, a negative action is just as bad. I could never quite remember my original phrasing for it, which was a little better, right? Like whether you do something through an accident or ulterior motives, something bad is still bad, but that doesn't sound right. And the same thing here, a negative action is just as bad. But the concept is very valuable because it's like it cuts down all this sort of conspiracy theory fallacy, like, well, was 9/11 an inside job or something like that? It doesn't matter necessarily. Well, I mean, it would matter to a higher level degree, but we can all agree it's bad and somebody should be penalized for it. The government should be blamed for allowing it to happen, etc., regardless whether they did it on purpose or it's just pure incompetence. So a better example is the border now, like how under Biden and Harris, like people trying to talk around that and say, oh, it's some conspiracy to try to replace people and get cheap labor and all this kind of stuff, get people to vote for them who they let across the border. Whether that's true or not is not what the topic should be about. Like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory and this and that. That might be true, but that's a higher level criticism. The main point is it's bad that millions of people are coming unchecked, right, without any proper legal process, any proper border process, assuming that's even the premise, that you consider that a bad thing, which most people do. But that would be the premise, that it's bad that it's happening. Then the secondary point could be, okay, maybe it's happening with this incentive, cui bono effect, etc., like who's benefiting. That would be secondary. But the most important part is don't get caught up on that. Like, okay, maybe it's not intentional. Maybe it's not part of any of those incentives to get more votes or to get cheap labor or whatever, replace people. But it could just be, okay, they're just that incompetent that they're still allowing to happen. So it's still bad, right? So don't get caught up in the middle ground of discussing whether it's intentional or not. Agree that it's bad and that somebody should still pay for it and somebody should have accountability for it and it should stop. The assumed measure of a longevity process is thwarted by practice, drugs, alcohol, etc. Ergo, half-mass hedonism is the inconsistent result. Longevity versus hedonism. So society assumes that people want to live as long as possible, for example, but yet those same people who are in that premise are going to drink and smoke. So if you truly want to live as long as possible, right, this is where the absolutist inherent tendency comes in. Like, you're not saying what the intention should be, right? You could try to live as long as you want, or you could try to do hedonism or something else, right? These measures are often at conflict with each other. But when you assume the measure of longevity, which again, society as a baseline basically does without needing to implicitly even state it, then what happens is, oh, but you drink and you smoke, so clearly that's not your measure. So now you're going to practice hedonism and that and longevity at the expense of one another. So you have to make up your mind for yourself what your measure is, and there's a great deal of contradiction and inconsistency with that, right? So it's not saying which measure is preferred or which one you should do, but that is a strange process. If you're self-aware, you would think, okay, maybe I shouldn't do those things then. That'll reduce my lifespan because longevity just means trying to live as long as possible. Or vice versa, or I should emphasize hedonism more if that's your priority. Like, make up your mind, basically, right? That just shows you're not sure of what you want. If you want to live as long as possible, then you wouldn't drink or smoke. If you want to do hedonism and pleasure at the expense of lifespan, then you could do it all the more and let your lifespan suffer. So there's some weird middle ground that you can't really define for yourself. Opposite interpretation can be summed up as follows, and most of these views are probably just me whenever I go back to look at this, but it would make me get a premium account to try to get more visibility on these, I guess. An addiction could make someone antisocial, but the very fact that that addiction appealed to them in the first place shows that they are already that way. So, for example, whether it be, oh, somebody wants to stay at home and play video games all day, or they're a drug addict, so that makes them keep to themselves, whatever it might be. It's not that, oh, you're going to blame that and say, oh, well, the only reason why they're antisocial is because they're doing that. Right, but why do you think they're doing it in the first place? If they, if being social was what all it was cracked out to be, or that's what they wanted to do, why would they have been drawn to that in the first place? It's almost like they were doing that in the first place because they're already not wanting to do the social element or some other external element, so they're doing that instead as a preference. And so that's the problem with the perception, is like, it's not because of the addiction that they're against doing something else or they don't like it. It's the fact that they're doing that addiction in the first place is a sign that they don't value that process. So it's the assuming intent fallacy of society. Like, you're assuming what everybody wants or what everybody values or should value or is trying to do. What if they just have a different measure of value? Like, for example, you have the ability to say, well, everybody should be doing this. And anytime anyone isn't, then you blame an influence, like, oh, it's because of this rock music that makes them do something else, or influence like drugs or media or whatever. But it can't just be the opposite. You can't look at it like, oh, this person's a loner because they're addicted to such and such, not that they're addicted to such and such because they're a loner in the first place, that they like doing it in the first place because of that, right? That they're not drawn to other people or whatever other expected tendency that you have. People are indoctrinated to be reactionary, to believe things are the way they are because that's the way they should be. In this sense, any era can identify the mode. I think I miswrote this. It's not modicum, it's mode of control is what I meant to put. I don't know why I put that. Of control in every one prior. I think they let you edit too, which I don't even like the idea of doing, because there should be an authenticity to it. Like, you know, like with YouTube comments, something will have 100,000 likes, but then you can just change it to something else and make it seem like that got the likes even though it didn't. Things are the way they are because that's the way they should be. In this sense, any era can identify the mode of control in everyone prior. Like, oh, how could people fall for the church, scamming people into giving it tribute and the amount of power it had, like in the feudal times and stuff. Yet they never question or identify their own. But meanwhile, you'll ignore something in the current time that you think is being used to control you, the media, etc. Like, oh, it could never happen to us. Or I like this one, like where people say, oh, well, see, when they did this mode of control in the past, they did it in this way. And that's not happening now, so it can't be happening, as if the method couldn't change. Like, yes, in the past they might have used a different method. Now they'll use a newer method with new technology that we have. Like, it's not going to be that obvious or exactly the same, but people are, you know, could ridicule one of the past. Like, oh, how could they fall for that? But yet they're falling for something else of their own in this era now, right? And totally oblivious to it. So you should always be aware and cautious of that tendency. The stimuli acme is a process without purpose. And again, that means the highest measure of pleasure and hedonism, like sex, is typically considered on the higher element of the hedonism hierarchy. Like, at the top of the list would be sex, but that could be debatable. But basically, it's reflected pretty well by the fact that the majority of music is to do with sex, the majority of humor is to do with sex, the majority of kind of like life goals and things like that. Even splitting your finances down the middle, like marriage system structure, everything. And there's one other element too, the fact that what else do I always use to identify music? Oh yeah, profanity, right? The highest measure people know is sexual in nature or some sort of stimulus, if you want to say it's some higher measure in substances, etc. Is a process without purpose. Just as 1 billion people would become 2 would become 4, and so on with no end. People will use offspring as an excuse in many ways, yet choose to have them anyway and then complain about them in various ways. So this might sound like a depopulation argument, but it's more just like a self-governance argument that you could control that, the village of 100 concept. I won't explain it too much here, but just it would be a process without end. So at some point, you as the individual have to just choose, like, okay, I'm going to defer to this process, or the absolutist tendency would be more like, you would not carry it on unless you're fully vouching for the state. So it is like there is no rhyme or reason. People just keep doing it on and on forever, and they'll just keep being more people. So it's not whether there should or shouldn't be, but at some point you should have some more self-awareness. Like, okay, I'm going to choose not to do it to try to keep it under control more, or something along those lines, or realize the overextension that comes with doing it uninhibited. The problem with power structures is twofold. So the main difference would be like, I don't consider like the government intervening or something like that. That's not the issue, right? With doing that, it's more like the individual would consider whether or not they want to do it and all the nuances of it. The problem with power structures is twofold. Their premise is that people are inherently bad and must be held in check, yet empowers some of the same people to that end. Also, the very same people who created problems are ultimately tasked to solve them. So the point is that, yeah, the basis on which law enforcement and politicians, etc., government itself exists would be that people need to be restrained. This is how I originally said it. I've kind of changed some of the phrasing here, maybe a little over time, but like the premise of laws and society is that, oh, people need to be restrained, right? That they're like animals that need to be restrained. But then to that end, what happens? You're going to empower those same animals that need to be restrained. And so now you're empowering the people that also need to be restrained for the sake of restraining the others, as if that won't cause a problem, because it's the same people. You could try to separate them and say, oh, but these are higher quality, higher class people, but it's the same base nature that you're saying, right? Like, these people inherently need to be restrained, and to that end, you're going to empower those same people. So not only are you not restraining them, but now you're also empowering them, which makes the inherent problem worse. To be offended is a fallacy. Either a statement is accurate, in which case you already know it to be true, at worst redundant, or it is false, in which case it deserves no more thought than was put into it. None. I mean, that one kind of speaks for itself, but basically either something is true, in which case you already know, or it's false, in which case you can just dismiss it. Why would it bother you? So in either case, you're not offended. You're just like, okay, I already know that, so what's the big deal? Right? There's nothing you could say that you wouldn't be aware of yourself or say to yourself, but hypothetically. You have to be a little objective there. But yeah, you would either already know it, so it's just a statement of the obvious, or it would be false, and you would just say, okay, why do I care then? You could just say anything random.